everything is starting to come to a head. And then in April of 1984, the FBI started to close in on the Sicilian Mafia Godfather, Gaetano Badalamenti. And this was the top guy in the Sicilian Mafia.
Correct.
Now, I guess in 78, there was somewhat of a war that happened in Sicily, and Badalamenti was actually banished from Sicily, but he still continued to run this whole drug operation.
And he went to Brazil.
Okay.
Okay. And also at that time, you had Tommaso Buscetta, who then turned to be against the mafia, and they had the Maxi trials in Sicily where they tried 300 mafioso at once. And I was the go-between between the Italian police and Tommaso. We had him in the witness protection program, and there was only one agent that knew where he was, and he lived next to him. So whenever we wanted Tommaso Buscetta, I would call the agent and we'd meet somewhere. At the time, they were living in Florida, and we would meet like in New Jersey, and I would bring him money from the Italian police because he testified at the trial. And so I remember one time I brought him $100,000 from the Italians to give him, and I paid it to him in New Jersey. And we used to talk, and he told me, he says, I was a man of honor. He says, you never touched a man's family. He says, they killed my son, my brother, my cousins. He says, they're not men of honor anymore. And finally he flipped. And that's when Judge Falcone came into the picture, who was an unbelievable man. Here was a man that was devoted to getting rid of the mafia. And I worked with Giovanni Falcone.
So Gaetano Badalamenti, he actually joined forces with Salvatore Catalano?
Yes.
Who was part of the Bonanno crime family in New York?
In New York and Brooklyn.
Okay. And with this connection, they moved what they say was $1.65 billion in heroin.
Without a doubt.
Which originally from the Middle East was imported into New York and then distributed through the United States.
Well, it was also coming in from Italy and Sicily, because what they were doing in the early 80s, they had a guy working at Alitalia in Milan. And that's, in those days, you could send unaccompanied baggage on a plane. I mean, you can't do that today. And so what they would do is they'd have a suitcase that they put heroin in, like 20 kilos, and they'd send it unaccompanied to JFK. Now, they had a baggage handler at Alitalia at JFK. When the baggage came in, he would grab that bag, and that's how they were bringing the heroin in. They were also bringing it in tiles, the pallets of tiles. They were bringing it in tomato cans. They were bringing it in coffee makers and furniture. But a lot of it was still coming from Sicily. But you're right when you say it was Catalano and Badalamenti. And the way we got Badalamenti is we had wiretaps on his nephew out in the Midwest who had a pizza shop. But the nephew was a real dummy. Badalamenti would try to talk to him in code to say, we're going to meet in such and such a place, And the nephew could never figure out what Badalamenti was saying. Finally, Badalamenti spurted, I'll meet you in Madrid. And that's how they grabbed him, in Madrid.
Okay, and his nephew was Pietro Alfano.
Correct.
Who owned a pizzeria in Detroit.
Correct.
So they go and meet up in Madrid. Badalamenti was there with his wife and his son, and the authorities scooped in and arrested them.
Correct.
And then the next day, the FBI hit 30 other mafia members all over the U.S.
Yes. But the thing that I want to bring out, during my undercover activity, once Laporta came to me and he says, look, he says, I need $100,000. He says, could you lend me the $100,000? He says, I'll give you two $50,000 bearer bonds that are getting 13% interest. And so I had to convince the suits in Washington that, hey, he's giving me real bearer bonds, you know. So when it came time for me to give him the bearer bonds back, he said, why don't you keep them? He says, they're getting 13% interest. And when you go to cash them in, we own the guy, the manager of the bank, okay? So we take one of the $50,000 bearer bonds, bring it to the bank, and he says, yeah, he says it's worth $48,000, meaning he's going to get $2,000, but there's no IRS forms. And but when I after we arrested the Sicilians, we seized all their records, and we saw that Giovanni Laporta had 5 distributors in Puerto Rico, and we had all the records. So I went down to Puerto Rico, contacted all 5 of them, and said, look, you know, Giovanni was arrested. I know you still owe $20,000. I know he fronted you a half kilo, the other guy. I says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. To show good faith, next week, I'm going to give the stuff to you at such and such a price. So I'll meet you all next Monday here in Puerto Rico. Well, Monday came and nobody showed up. And so when we eventually arrested them, we said, how come you didn't show up that Monday? Because the day after I met them, the real person that took over for the Sicilians had already contacted them to continue business. So we didn't do anything to the Sicilian Mafia. They were in business the next day.